I'm a 27-year-old woman, but this story starts 4 years ago. You know that feeling when you find an apartment that just feels right? That's how I felt 4 years ago when Jake and I first walked into Unit 4B. Sure, the kitchen cabinets were from the 90s, and the bathroom tile had seen better days. But standing on that balcony, looking out at the tree-lined street and the local coffee shop where I'd end up spending countless Sunday mornings, I knew this was home. The rent was actually under our budget, a miracle in this city, and the location was perfect. 10 minutes from my hospital where I work night shifts as a nurse, and 15 from Jake's office. We could walk to the farmer's market on weekends, and there was this amazing Thai place right around the corner that became our go-to for lazy Friday nights. Living here has been everything we hoped for. Our upstairs neighbors, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, would bring us cookies during the holidays. Mrs. Chen next door would collect our packages when we were away, and we'd water her plants when she visited her grandkids. It wasn't just an apartment building, it was a community. Jake and I settled into a comfortable routine. He'd leave for work around 8 a.m., and I'd usually get home from my night shift around 6 a.m., just in time to have breakfast together before he headed out. We'd wave to Mr. Rodriguez, the maintenance guy who's worked here for 20 years, as he tended to the building's small garden. Sometimes we'd help him plant new flowers in spring. We weren't planning to stay here forever. We've been saving for a house, dreaming about a backyard where Jake can finally build his wood workshop, and I can have the herb garden I've always wanted. But for now, this place was perfect. The rent increases were reasonable, the management was responsive, and our neighbors were like family. That all changed 3 months ago when Mr. Davis moved out of the unit below us. He'd lived there for over a decade. Quiet guy, always polite, never had any issues. The day the moving trucks came, I brought him a goodbye card. He seemed almost apologetic about leaving, mentioning something about his daughter wanting him closer to her new baby. I remember standing on our balcony, watching the moving company load up the last of his furniture. Jake was watering our plants. We'd built quite a collection over the years, turning our balcony into a little urban oasis. I hope whoever moves in is as cool as Mr. Davis, he said, accidentally splashing some water over the edge as he reached for the hanging pothos. Little did we know that small splash would come back to haunt us. The next day, a sleek black BMW pulled into the parking lot and I got my first glimpse of our new neighbor. He was wearing what looked like an expensive suit, talking loudly on his phone about some business deal. Something about his demeanor made me uneasy. The way he barked at the movers, how he immediately started complaining about the parking situation to Mr. Rodriguez. I tried to shake off the feeling. Don't judge a book by its cover, my mom always says. Maybe he was just stressed about moving. Jake and I even discussed bringing down some welcome cookies like the Hendersons had done for us. But before we could, I started noticing strange things. The way he'd stand on his balcony, looking up at ours with this disapproving expression. How he'd make a show of inspecting the ground beneath our balcony every morning, taking pictures with his phone. The first complaint came exactly 1 week after he moved in. I was doing dishes after dinner, running the garbage disposal like I had countless times before. Nothing unusual. Just cleaning up after making Jake's favorite pasta. The next morning, there was an email from management about excessive noise and inconsiderate use of appliances during quiet hours. It was 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. I wish I could say that first complaint was just a misunderstanding, that maybe our new neighbor was just particular about noise. But looking back, it was like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. You know the thunder's coming. You just don't know how bad the storm will be. The day after the garbage disposal incident, I ran into Mrs. Chen in the hallway. She had that look on her face. The one your mom gives you when she's about to deliver bad news but doesn't want to upset you. Have you met him yet? She asked, keeping her voice low. The new tenant downstairs? Turns out Mr. Suit, I still didn't know his actual name, had already made quite an impression on the building. He'd complained about Mrs. Chen's grandkids being too loud when they visited last weekend. They were watching Frozen for crying out loud. The Hendersons mentioned he'd filed a formal complaint about their wind chimes, the same ones that had been gently tinkling on their balcony for the past 6 years. I started noticing more things about him. He had this habit of standing in the parking lot just watching. He'd take photos of everything. Cars, the building, people's balconies. Once I caught him filming Mrs. Chen as she brought in her groceries. When she asked what he was doing, he muttered something about documenting violations and stormed off to his unit. Jake suggested we try talking to him directly, clear the air. Maybe he's just particular about his space, he said, ever the optimist. So one evening, we caught him coming in from work. Hi, we're your upstairs neighbors, I started, putting on my best nurse dealing with difficult patient smile. We wanted to introduce ourselves properly. He cut me off mid-sentence. Oh, I know exactly who you are. His voice was cold, calculated. You're the ones who think it's acceptable to flood my balcony every day. Before I could even process that accusation, he pulled out his phone, showing us a video of water droplets. Literally just a few drops of water falling from our balcony plants after Jake watered them. That's normal drainage from, Jake tried to explain, but Mr. Suit wasn't interested in explanations. I've dealt with inconsiderate neighbors before. He interrupted again. I know how to handle this. Then he turned and walked into his unit, slamming the door so hard Mrs. Chen's welcome mat shifted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his words. I know how to handle this. It felt like a threat. But what could he possibly do about a few drops of water? We were following all building rules, being considerate neighbors like we'd always been. The next week, the complaints escalated. Management emails started arriving daily. Apparently, we were now stomping at all hours, walking normally to the bathroom, dragging furniture, pushing in dining chairs after dinner, and conducting unauthorized business activities. I was doing yoga in the living room. Each complaint was accompanied by video evidence. Shaky footage from his balcony, trying to capture any sound or movement from our unit. He'd installed some kind of security camera aimed upward at our balcony, its red light blinking constantly like an angry eye watching our every move. The other neighbors started avoiding him completely. Even Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been nothing but friendly to every tenant for 2 decades, would wait until Mr. Suit left for work before doing any maintenance near his unit. The building's atmosphere had changed. That sense of community we'd loved was being poisoned by his presence. One evening, I was out on our balcony trying to save my wilting herbs. I'd been afraid to water them properly, given his complaints, and they were suffering. As I carefully measured out tiny amounts of water, trying to keep any from dripping down, I heard his voice below. "You better not get a single drop on my property." I looked down to see him standing there, phone raised, recording me watering my dying plants. That's when I noticed something odd. His own balcony was pristine. Not a speck of dirt, not a single plant, but scattered around the edges were small, plastic cups, positioned strategically to catch any water that might fall from above. It hit me then. He wasn't just being difficult. He was setting us up, documenting everything, building some kind of case against us. The question was, why? The plastic cups were just the beginning. After spotting them on his balcony, I started paying more attention to his evidence-gathering routine. Every morning before work, he'd check each cup, photograph their contents, and empty them into labeled containers. Who keeps a logbook of balcony drips? Mr. Suit, apparently. Jake was starting to get really worried. I'd catch him obsessively checking the floor when he walked, trying to step as lightly as possible. He stopped inviting his friends over for their weekly game nights. The sound of laughter apparently qualified as disturbing the peace, according to our downstairs watchdog. Our home didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like we were living in a surveillance state. The breaking point came during one of my days off. I was catching up on sleep after a particularly rough week of night shifts when our landline rang. Yes, we still have a landline, mainly because the hospital sometimes needs to reach me during the day. It was the property manager, Angela. "We've received another complaint," she started, sounding tired. I was getting used to these calls, but what she said next floored me. "Your downstairs neighbor has provided evidence that you're running an illegal business from your apartment." I sat up in bed, fully awake now. "What? That's ridiculous. I'm a nurse. I work at St. Mary's." He submitted video recordings of multiple people entering and leaving your apartment at regular intervals, particularly during evening hours. Angela paused. "He suggests you might be running some kind of inappropriate establishment." My blood ran cold as I realized what he was implying. Those multiple people were my coworkers. Nurses from my unit who sometimes carpooled with me to work. We'd grab coffee at my place before heading to the hospital together. It was a tradition we'd had for years. I was shaking with anger as I explained this to Angela. She believed me. She'd known us for 4 years after all, but said she had to document every complaint. "Just be careful," she warned. "He's becoming very persistent with his documentation." That evening, I heard voices in the hallway. Peeking through the peephole, I saw Mr. Suit talking to the Hendersons. He was showing them something on his phone, probably his precious video evidence. Mrs. Henderson looked upset, and her husband was shaking his head. As they turned to go back to their apartment, I caught a snippet of their conversation. "Never had any trouble with them before you started all this." Later that night, as I was getting ready for my shift, I noticed something odd about my flower vase on the balcony. It had been perfectly upright that morning, but now it was tilted slightly, teetering dangerously close to the edge. I carefully moved it back to its usual spot, making sure it was stable. The next morning, when I got home from work, the vase was knocked over completely. Water and soil had spilled onto the balcony, and presumably onto Mr. Suit's precious evidence-collecting cups below. The strange thing was, there hadn't been any wind that night. The other plants were untouched, their leaves perfectly still. Jake examined the vase closely. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a small mark on the balcony railing. "Doesn't it look like someone reached up and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The implication was clear. Our neighbor was no longer content with just documenting violations. He was creating them. We bought a security camera that day, a small one that could monitor our balcony without being obvious. If Mr. Suit wanted to play the documentation game, we could play too. But we hadn't even finished setting it up when we heard the familiar sound of his phone camera clicking below, followed by his voice clearly carrying up, "Smile for the evidence!" I was exhausted, running on no sleep, and suddenly something in me snapped. I looked down at him standing there with his phone pointed up at us, at his smug expression, at those stupid little cups lined up like soldiers on his balcony. "You know what?" I called down, surprising even myself with how calm I sounded. "Keep taking pictures. Make sure you get my good side." His face darkened. "Oh, I'll get everything on camera," he promised. "Every single violation." What he didn't know was that this was the last straw. As I watched him retreat into his apartment, probably to add today's photos to his ever-growing evidence file, I started formulating a plan. If he wanted to document violations so badly, maybe it was time to give him something worth documenting. The morning after my little camera confrontation with Mr. Suit, I came home from my shift to find an official-looking notice taped to our door. At first, I thought it was another noise complaint. They had become such a regular occurrence that Jake had started keeping them in a folder labeled Greatest Hits. But this was different. This was a pet violation notice, complete with a $50 fine. I stood there in the hallway, still in my scrubs, reading and rereading the notice. Pet violation? We didn't have a pet. We'd talked about getting a cat someday, but with my night shifts and Jake's long hours, it never seemed fair to the animal. I took a photo of the notice and sent it to Jake, who was already at work. His response came immediately. What the actual hell? I walked into our apartment, dropped my bag, and fired off a quick email to Angela. There must be some mistake. We don't have any pets. I thought that would be the end of it. A simple clerical error. Easily corrected. Oh, how wrong I was. Angela's response came while I was trying to fall asleep. I heard my phone buzz and against my better judgment checked it. Her email made me sit straight up in bed, sleep forgotten. Multiple complaints have been filed about urine being discharged from your balcony. Initially, it was assumed this was from an unauthorized pet, but given your statement that you don't own any animals, we are forced to conclude that the source is human in nature. This is a serious lease violation. I read the email to Jake. When he got home that evening, watching his face go from confusion to disbelief to outright anger. Human in nature? He repeated. Is she actually suggesting that we're, peeing off our balcony? Apparently, I said, still trying to process the absurdity of it all. And according to her, there's photographic evidence. Jake started pacing, something he only does when he's really upset. Evidence of what? Water from plants? That vase he knocked over? This is insane. We decided to go talk to Angela in person. The office was still open, and this wasn't something we wanted to handle over email. As we walked down to the leasing office, we passed Mr. Suit in the hallway. He had this smirk on his face that made my skin crawl. Angela looked uncomfortable when we walked in. Before we could even start explaining, she pulled out a thick file folder. I need you to understand the seriousness of these complaints, she began, spreading out photos across her desk. The evidence was exactly what we expected. Pictures of water droplets on his balcony, dark patches on the concrete that could have been from anything, and weirdly angled shots up at our balcony that made normal watering of plants look suspicious. But then she pulled out something else, a small glass vial. Your downstairs neighbor submitted this for testing, she said, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. He claims this is a sample of the liquid from his balcony. I felt like I was in some bizarre alternate reality. Are you saying he collected what he thinks is our urine and brought it to you? The absurdity of the situation suddenly hit me, and I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Jake joined in, and soon we were both practically crying with laughter, while Angela sat there, looking increasingly uncomfortable. This isn't funny, she tried to say, but even she seemed to be fighting back a smile. We have to take all complaints seriously. Okay, I said, wiping tears from my eyes. Let's be serious. You've known us for 4 years. We've never had a single complaint before this man moved in. Does this really seem plausible to you? Angela sighed, pushing the photos away. Off the record? No. But he's being very persistent. He's threatening legal action against the building if we don't address his complaints. He's already had his lawyer send several letters. His lawyer? Jake interrupted. Over imaginary pee? That's when Mrs. Chen appeared in the office doorway. She'd apparently overheard everything. You need to know something about your neighbor, she said, her usually cheerful face serious. He's done this before. Mrs. Chen insisted we talk somewhere private, so we ended up in her apartment. Her walls were covered with family photos, and the smell of jasmine tea filled the air. Such a contrast to the tension we'd just left behind in the office. As she prepared tea for us, she explained what she'd discovered. My daughter works in property management, she said, setting down our cups. When I told her about your situation, she did some digging. Your neighbor, Mr. James Norton, he's done this at 3 other apartment complexes in the last 5 years. She pulled out her tablet, showing us news articles and court records her daughter had found. The pattern was always the same. He'd move in, immediately start documenting violations by his neighbors, escalate to legal threats, and then either get the tenants evicted or force them to move out from the stress. But why? Jake asked, scrolling through the articles. What does he get out of it? Mrs. Chen's expression darkened. At his last building, after he got the upstairs neighbors evicted, he sued the property management company for emotional distress and negligence. He won a significant settlement. My hands were shaking as I held my teacup. So we're just, what? Pawns in his lawsuit scheme? The worst part, Mrs. Chen continued, is that he's actually a real estate lawyer. He knows exactly how to work the system. He documents everything meticulously, builds these elaborate cases. My daughter says he's becoming notorious in the property management community, but he's careful to stay just within legal bounds. That night, I couldn't sleep, even though I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours. I kept thinking about all those other tenants he'd targeted, imagining their stress, their frustration. Had they also lain awake, wondering what ridiculous accusation would come next? Jake found me on the balcony at 3 a.m., staring down at those stupid evidence-collecting cups. We need to make a decision, he said softly. We can either move out now, or what? I asked, though I already knew what he was thinking. We'd both been tiptoeing around the idea ever since the urine accusation, or we make his documentation project really interesting. There was an edge to Jake's voice I'd never heard before. I thought about how much this place meant to us, our first real home together, the community we'd built, the garden we'd grown, 4 years of memories, all being poisoned by one calculating, manipulative man. The next day, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I needed time to think, to plan. Jake and I spent hours researching tenant laws, noise ordinances, studying the building's lease agreement. If Norton wanted to play legal games, we needed to know the rules. We also started documenting everything, ourselves. Every interaction, every false accusation, every threatening message. I reached out to my college friend who'd become a lawyer, sending her everything we'd gathered. Her response was encouraging. We weren't doing anything wrong, and his pattern of harassment could actually work against him, but the stress was taking its toll. I started having anxiety attacks before leaving for work, wondering what new complaints I'd find when I got home. Jake's usually cheerful demeanor had turned dark and withdrawn. We were fighting more, snapping at each other over little things. This wasn't us. The breaking point came when I overheard Norton on the phone in the parking lot. He was talking to someone, probably his lawyer, about how he was building an excellent case and how these nurses make great targets because of their irregular hours. Something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about every tenant he'd harassed, every life he'd disrupted for his twisted game. And now he was specifically targeting healthcare workers? Oh, hell no. I walked up to our apartment, my mind surprisingly clear for the first time in weeks. Jake was at the kitchen table updating our documentation folder. He took one look at my face and knew something had changed. I'm done being defensive, I said, pulling out my laptop. It's time we give Mr. Norton exactly what he wants. Something worth documenting. Jake watched me pull up the building's lease agreement on my laptop, a slow smile spreading across his face. What are you thinking? Remember what my lawyer friend said? We're not doing anything wrong. We're just living our lives. So maybe, I pulled up the building's quiet hours policy. Maybe we should start really living. We spent the next few hours crafting what we called Operation Documentation. The key was to stay completely within our rights while giving Norton exactly what he craved. Evidence. But this time, it would be evidence that showed just how ridiculous his complaints were. First, we studied the lease agreement like it was holy scripture. Quiet hours were from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Norton left for work at 6 a.m. sharp every morning. We'd heard his car start at exactly the same time for months, which meant that at 2 a.m. when I got home from my shift, we had a 4-hour window to exercise. Look at this, Jake said, pointing to a clause in the lease. Regular household activities are permitted at all hours, including reasonable exercise. He grinned. How do you feel about taking up jump rope? We mapped out our plan meticulously. Everything had to be legal, documented, and, most importantly, completely innocent. We weren't being malicious. We were just a health-conscious couple with an unusual schedule trying to stay fit. I ordered a yoga mat with extra cushioning, for noise reduction, of course. Jake found weighted jump ropes that were perfect for cardio. We even got resistance bands for strength training. All perfectly normal exercise equipment. But we didn't stop there. We needed witnesses, people who could testify that our activities were reasonable if Norton tried to escalate things legally. So we reached out to our neighbors. Mrs. Chen was all in. My Tai Chi group meets at 5 a.m. in the park, she said with a wink. Perhaps you'd like to practice with us. In your apartment? She even offered to write a statement about how normal it was for people to exercise at unusual hours, given her own early morning routine. The Hendersons contributed too, in their own way. You know, Mrs. Henderson mentioned casually, we've always been early risers. Never bothered us to hear people up and about at odd hours. That's apartment living. She made sure to mention this loudly while Norton was checking his evidence cups one morning. We also started our own documentation. Jake set up our security camera to record our balcony 24/7, catching Norton in the act if he tried to interfere. With our plants again, I kept a detailed log of every interaction, every complaint, every passive-aggressive comment he made. The final touch was psychological. We knew Norton recorded everything from his balcony, so we made sure he could hear us discussing our normal activities clearly. Honey, I'm home, I'd call out at 2 a.m. Time for our doctor-recommended exercise routine. Of course, dear. You know how important it is to stay healthy with your demanding nursing schedule. We even printed out WebMD articles about the benefits of exercise for night shift workers and, accidentally, dropped them where Norton would find them during his evidence-gathering rounds. But the real genius of our plan wasn't just the noise, it was the timing. We knew his schedule by heart now. He needed exactly 7 hours of sleep to function at work. He'd mentioned it loudly on his phone several times while documenting our violations. With his 6 a.m. departure time, that meant he had to be asleep by 11 p.m., and we knew something else, something crucial that we'd discovered during our research. Norton had a big case coming up at his law firm. We'd found it in the public court records. A case that could make or break his career. A case that required him to be sharp, focused, and well-rested. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. We set everything up meticulously. The exercise equipment was arranged for maximum legal impact. Our documentation systems were in place. We had witness statements about the reasonableness of early morning exercise. We even had medical articles supporting the importance of post-shift physical activity for night workers. Everything was ready. As I stood in our living room that first night, jump rope in hand, I felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. For us, for the previous tenants he'd harassed, and for anyone else he might target in the future. Ready? Jake asked, unrolling his yoga mat. I checked the time. 2 a.m. exactly. Perfect. Let's give Mr. Norton something worth documenting. The first night of Operation Documentation started with jumping jacks. Lots of them. The steady rhythm of our feet hitting the floor at 2 a.m. was oddly satisfying. Knowing Norton's camera was probably recording every single bounce, we made sure to count out loud. For proper form, of course. 98, 99, 100. Our voices carried just enough to be heard, but not enough to violate any noise ordinances. We'd tested the decibel levels with a phone app, keeping everything within legal limits. The jump rope came next. Jake had found YouTube videos on proper technique, and we'd practiced during normal hours to perfect the sound. That perfect whip snap of rope against floor, followed by the soft landing of feet. All totally normal exercise sounds. By 2:30 a.m., we heard the first signs of success. Norton's heavy footsteps pacing below, followed by the distinctive click of his phone camera. Right on schedule. Time for yoga, I announced cheerfully, loud, enough to be heard through the floor. The doctor says it's essential for stress relief after night shifts. Jake started his yoga routine, complete with exaggerated breathing exercises. Inhale and exhale. Feel the tension leaving your body, each instruction punctuated by the squeak of his yoga mat against the floor. At 3 a.m., Norton started playing white noise on his speakers. We could hear it through the floor. He'd turned it up loud enough to make a point. Perfect. More documentation for our records. By 4 a.m., we'd moved on to resistance band training. The bands made satisfying snapping sounds against the floor, all while we maintained our cheerful exercise banter. This is so great for my posture after 12 hours of nursing. Remember what the physical therapist said about proper form? Heard Norton's voice below, apparently on the phone despite the hour. They're doing it again. Listen to this, followed by the sound of him recording our perfectly legal exercise routine. The next morning, right on schedule, a new complaint arrived in our email. Norton had submitted a 15-page document detailing our excessive noise and deliberate harassment, complete with time-stamped audio recordings and a demand for immediate eviction. Angela from management called me later that day, trying to hide the amusement in her voice. He submitted recordings of exercise noises? Oh yes, I replied innocently. Jake and I are on a new health kick. It's the only time that works with my nursing schedule. Is there something wrong with exercising in our apartment? No, she said quickly. The lease specifically allows for regular household activities, including exercise. Just maybe some floor cushioning? Of course, we're already using yoga. Mats for noise reduction. We're very considerate neighbors. This went on for 2 weeks. Every night from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., we maintained our careful routine of completely legal, perfectly documented exercise. Norton's complaints became increasingly desperate. He started recording every sound, every footstep, every dropped jump rope. That chew. Dark circles under his eyes grew more pronounced each day. We'd see him leaving for work, his pristine suits becoming increasingly wrinkled, his precious evidence-collecting cups sometimes knocked over in his haste to document our latest violation. Then came the morning we'd been waiting for. The day of his big court case. We'd seen it marked on the legal calendar. Norton versus Metropolitan Development Corp., 9 a.m., a case that could make or break his career. That night, we were extra thorough with our routine. Jump rope at 2 a.m., yoga with extra vocal breathing exercises at 3 a.m., resistance band training with enthusiastic counting at 4 a.m., and for the grand finale, a full hour of high-intensity interval training, complete with jumping jacks, burpees, and mountain climbers. We heard him on the phone at 5 a.m., his voice cracking with exhaustion. They're still at it. Listen, this is deliberate harassment, followed by the sound of something, probably one of his evidence cups, being thrown against the wall. At 5:55 a.m., just before his usual departure time, everything went quiet in his apartment. Too quiet. Then we heard it. The sound of his alarm going off again at 6:30 a.m., followed by panicked cursing and rushing around. He'd overslept on the most important day of his career. Through our balcony, we watched him sprint to his car, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled, his precious evidence folder dropping papers across the parking lot. As he peeled out of the parking lot, Mrs. Chen walked by with her Tai Chi group, calmly collecting the scattered documents. My daughter is in the courthouse clerk's office, she told me later that day, a small smile playing on her lips. She said Mr. Norton arrived an hour late to his own hearing, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. The judge was not impressed. But even as we celebrated this small victory, we knew the real test was still to come. Norton's retaliation came 3 days after his court disaster, and it wasn't what we expected. Instead of more complaints or legal threats, he went straight to nuclear options. He called the police. We were in the middle of our 3 a.m. yoga routine when we heard the knock. 2 officers stood at our door, looking slightly embarrassed to be there. Norton was behind them, still in his pajamas, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. "These are the ones," he declared. "I want them arrested for harassment and disturbing the peace." The older officer, who introduced herself as Officer Martinez, asked to see our documentation. Jake calmly retrieved our folder, complete with lease agreement highlights, medical recommendations for night shift workers, decibel readings, and our own video evidence of Norton's escalating behavior. "Sir," Officer Martinez turned to Norton, "their activities are within legal noise limits and permitted by their lease. And this," she gestured to his phone, still recording everything, "could be considered harassment on your part." Norton's face went through an impressive array of colors. "But they're doing it on purpose. They're targeting me. I have evidence." "Evidence? Of what?" I asked innocently. Us following our doctor's recommendations for maintaining a healthy lifestyle while working night shifts. Would you like to see the medical documentation? That's when Mrs. Chen appeared in her doorway, followed by the Hendersons. One by one, our neighbors emerged, all with their own stories about Norton's behavior. Mrs. Chen's daughter had even driven over with a thick folder of documents about his previous lawsuits and tenant complaints. The officers took statements from everyone. By the time they left 2 hours later, Norton had been given a warning about filing false police reports and harassment. His face was a mask of cold fury as he watched his carefully constructed scheme crumble. The next day, Angela called us into the office. Norton had apparently been busy. He'd sent a novel-length email to corporate headquarters about us, but this time his obsessive documentation habit backfired spectacularly. Corporate reviewed all of his complaints and evidence. Angela told us, fighting back a smile. They found his behavior concerning enough to launch their own investigation. Turns out this isn't the first property management company he's tried to sue. They're terminating his lease for creating a hostile living environment. Jake and I sat there, stunned. They're evicting him, they're giving him 30 days, and, she lowered her voice, they're adding him to a shared database of problem tenants. He's going to have a hard time pulling this scheme anywhere else. Norton didn't take the news well. We heard him raging on the phone to his lawyer, threatening to sue everyone from the property management company to Mrs. Chen's Tai Chi group, but his threats fell flat. He documented himself right into a corner. The day he moved out was, surprisingly, anticlimactic. No drama. No final confrontation, just a moving truck, and Norton supervising the loading of his furniture, his precious evidence cups conspicuously absent from his balcony. As we watched from our window, Mrs. Chen appeared with a tea tray. In Chinese culture, she said, pouring us each a cup, we believe that sometimes the universe has a way of restoring balance. The building slowly returned to normal. The Hendersons' wind chimes tinkled freely again. Mrs. Chen's grandkids visited, without fear of documentation. Jake's friends resumed their game nights. Our balcony garden flourished, water dripping freely without fear of evidence collection. We did end up moving out eventually, but on our own terms. Jake got a promotion that let us finally buy that house we'd been dreaming of, the one with space for his workshop and my herb garden. The day we gave notice, Angela seemed genuinely sad to see us go. You know, she said, we've updated our tenant screening process. We now specifically look for patterns of litigation and complaints at previous residences. She winked. Your little exercise routine inspired some corporate policy changes. On our last night in the apartment, Jake and I sat on our balcony, looking out at the view we'd loved for 4 years. The street was quiet. The local coffee shop's lights dimmed for closing time. Everything felt peaceful, like the whole Norton episode had been a strange dream. Should we do one last workout? Jake asked, grinning. For old time's sake? I laughed and pulled out our jump ropes. At exactly 2 a.m. we began our routine, but this time not out of spite or revenge. We jumped and laughed and remembered how this place, despite everything, had been our first real home together. The next morning, we found a card signed by all our neighbors. Inside, Mrs. Chen had written something that made us both tear up. Sometimes, the best revenge is living well and giving others a taste of their own medicine along the way.